The mere exposure effect. There's a strange way the mind decides what it likes. It doesn't always choose what is best. It doesn't always choose what is true. Often, it chooses what is familiar. This is the mere exposure effect, the psychological phenomenon where repeated exposure creates preference, comfort, and trust without conscious reasoning. 1. When familiarity feels like truth. The mere exposure effect occurs when we develop a preference for things simply because we encounter them often. A face seen repeatedly feels safer. A voice heard often sounds more credible. An idea repeated enough times begins to feel right. Not because it is correct, but because it is known. The mind equates familiarity with safety, and safety feels good. 2. Why the brain loves the familiar. The human brain is designed to reduce uncertainty. Newness requires attention. Familiarity requires less effort. From an evolutionary perspective, what was familiar was less likely to be dangerous. So the nervous system relaxes in the presence of repetition. The brain doesn't ask, "Is this good?" It asks, "Have I survived this before?" 3. Comfort before evaluation. One of the most subtle dangers of the mere exposure effect is that comfort precedes evaluation. Before logic engages, emotion settles. Something feels right before it is examined. This is why first impressions can soften over time. Why repeated messages feel convincing. Why we trust what we hear often. Familiarity lowers resistance. 4. Repetition as persuasion. The mere exposure effect is widely used, often without our awareness. In advertising, in media, in politics, in social platforms, the same message repeated quietly does not argue. It settles. Eventually, disagreement feels uncomfortable, not because it is wrong, but because it disrupts familiarity. 5. When preference is not choice. Over time, repetition shapes taste. Music grows on you. Ideas feel obvious. Opinions become default. But preference shaped by exposure is not always preference chosen. We begin to mistake conditioning for alignment. The mind says, "This feels like me," when in reality, it feels like what you've seen most. 6. The moral weight of repetition. The mere exposure effect raises an ethical question. Who controls what we see most often? Because repetition does not need truth to be effective. It needs presence. False ideas repeated enough times can feel legitimate. Harmful narratives repeated quietly can feel normal. Silence around alternatives amplifies exposure's power. 7. Familiarity in relationships. The mere exposure effect also shapes intimacy. We may stay in situations not because they are healthy, but because they are familiar. Patterns repeat. Discomfort becomes normal. Stability replaces growth. The known feels safer than the unknown, even when the known hurts. 8. Awareness without rejection. Understanding the mere exposure effect does not require rejecting familiarity. Familiarity is not the enemy. Unquestioned familiarity is. Awareness creates distance between feeling and truth. It allows you to ask, "Do I like this?" Or, "Am I used to it?" "Do I believe this?" Or, "Have I heard often?" "Does this align with me?" Or, "Is it simply familiar?" 9. Reclaiming choice. Choice returns when exposure is examined, when repetition is interrupted, when novelty is allowed. The nervous system adapts. Comfort expands. What once felt unfamiliar becomes possible. 10. Responsibility beyond familiarity. The mere exposure effect reveals a quiet truth. The mind prefers what it knows, not necessarily what is right. Familiarity feels safe, but growth lives beyond it. This is Ethiax, where psychology meets responsibility. And responsibility begins when familiarity no longer replaces judgment.